Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Virtual Genealogical Association 2020 conference. This session is Surname Origins, Why, When, and Why Then, presented by Wayne Shepheard. Wayne graduated in geology from the University of Calgary and spent over 40 years applying his knowledge and expertise in the exploration for oil and gas, primarily in Western Canada. Following retirement, he has spent much of his time involved with family history research, exploring families in North America, continental Europe, and the United Kingdom. Wayne is active in expanding his interests and writing about natural phenomena and their impacts on people and communities. His view is that humankind has always had to adapt to the ever-changing physical environments in which they lived. In his genealogical work, Wayne has been particularly mindful of stories concerning families that were both negatively and positively impacted by changes to their habitat and to the disasters which sometimes overwhelmed them. Wayne published a book, Surviving Mother Nature's Tests, that relates many of the situations observed in nature. Wayne, thank you for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate having the opportunity to present my views on the origin and timing of surnames as part of the VGA's 2020 conference. Just a warning here, I'll cover a lot of ground in this presentation regarding definitions, areas, sources of information, and ideas. Listeners may want to come back later and inspect the slides more closely to get the most out of the material. And of course, use the handout for links to the relevant web pages. Now, we all know, or most of us know, I think, that surnames are a relatively recent thing in human history. Many societies have used second names to distinguish people and families, but the modern world's adoption of formal family names only dates back about 700 years. In this presentation, I'll show how many elements came together, particularly the impact of Mother Nature, to explain why surnames became common, when it happened, and why it was during a particular time period. Most examples and documents I'm using are from the United Kingdom, firstly because most of my family originated there, and most of my research has been centered there. It also helps, of course, that most of the information I've found in relevant records and studies were published in English. Much of what transpired in the UK, though, is also going on in the mainland Europe, including the expansion of the use of surnames, but we'll leave that discussion to others at another time. I don't presume to be an expert in medieval genealogy, but I have come across and used many of the old records during work on several projects. My interest was piqued, of course, while researching my favorite subjects of natural phenomena and the Little Ice Age and their impacts on family history. There are courses one can take to learn about old records. The UK National Archives, for example, has guides to help you find medieval records. And then there's always the internet and websites that focus on the medieval period. But if you want to know about when surnames began to be used and what events may have contributed, you have to go back beyond the time when most of the records we normally use in our family history research originated. And that means documents older than the 15th century. In this presentation, I'll show just a few of the many record types available in the study of medieval genealogy and what information they can provide on the subject matter of surnames. So what is a surname? The definition, according to my Canadian Oxford Dictionary, is hereditary name common to all members of a family as distinct from a given name. This is different than nicknames or other types of descriptions used to identify people, although some of these came to be formally used as surnames. We can imagine that in various early communities, the blacksmith named John may have been referred to as John the Smith, or as a shortened version, John Smith. Ralph, who was a baker, might have been called Ralph Baker, or perhaps Ralph Boulanger, if he was of French or Norman origin, or Rodolphus Pistorius in documents written in Latin. Now, in looking for my own name in medieval records, I keep in mind what the Latin and French versions might have been, Berceri for Latin and Berger for French. You always got to remember that names may also have been spelled many different ways in the old texts. In some northern communities, Catherine, the daughter of a man named Edward, might have been come to known as Catherine Edward's daughter, as shown in this 1761 marriage record. That actually is the name recorder for one of my wife's fourth great-grandmothers who lived in the Shetlands in the 18th century. The patronymic style of name probably comes from their Norse origins. There are several females with this last name in the parish records, born about the same time in one area of the Shetlands, but we've not found any information yet that shows their parents or whether they were related to each other. Perhaps the name of her husband here, Andrew Cooper, as shown also on this marriage record, originally came from people who made buckets and barrels for a living. We always kid that many of the Cooper ancestors were short and stocky, most of them shaped like barrels. So, which leads us to what types of surnames developed over the centuries. You may be familiar with the various categories of surnames. Many of these suggest origins, but they may be the result of the timing of when they were used and not necessarily explain the reasons they were adopted by whole families. For example, that blacksmith I mentioned might have been called John Smith, but if his son James took up a different trade, such as working with brick or stone, he might have been known as James Mason. Neither name may necessarily have longevity or continuity within a family, and therefore would not be surnames as we define them today. Now, listed here are the 8 main types of surnames as defined by the Guild of One Name Studies. These are primarily British. Locative names are derived, obviously, from the place where someone came from or lived, and that's the most common type of surname in England. You can subdivide locative names into topographical, which are derived from a distinctive geographical feature, such as green or hill, or toponymic, which are derived from a special place name, such as London, or in popular lore, someone like Robin de Locksley, whose story dates from the late 12th century. Occupational names are derived from the occupation of the bearer, for example, abbot, cheeseman, draper, shoemaker, thatcher. Postholder names are derived from people who held a particular post, such as steward, bailey, or knight. Patronymic names are derived from the forename of the father. Different countries had different modifications of the names, for example, Fitzgerald, Johnson, MacDonald, O'Brien, or as I just showed, Edward's daughter. Matronymic names are derived from the forename of the mother, of course. Things like Beaton from Beatrice or Margetson from Margaret. Genitive names are names implying ownership of something, such as squires or manors. A diminutive forename may have been altered to be used as a surname. In medieval times, this was often with the addition of suffixes like cock, let, or kin, names like Hancock or Bartlett. And then were nicknames or physical appearance that came to be used as surnames like Fox, Longfill, Redhead, or Too Good. The early locative names have either prepositions of DE or ATT in front of the place name. I'll use actually the name descriptive here as a qualifier for some of these categories, as part of a name might have reference to an activity the individual may have been involved with, an occupation, a physical trait, or a combination of types of names. And most of these had LE, the, prefixed in front of them. The Romans developed a scheme of multiple names, and there's some evidence that certain earlier societies and civilizations also did so. The praenomen was an individual's personal or informal name given to him or her by their parents. Each child in a family would have had a different one. There were generally naming patterns, as there seemed to be with most civilizations, with the eldest son named after his father or grandfather, and younger sons named after uncles or other male ancestors. The nomen, called a gens, designated a clan or a family. Extended members of the family shared the nomen, indicating they descended from a common ancestor. While originally an additional personal name, the cognomen came to identify a whole family branch. That cognomen, though, could change over time or be added as they were earned or circumstances changed in the families. With the rather rigid naming conventions, it was not unusual to have men with the same names over several generations. For example, Marcus Tullius Cicero, who was known as the Orator, was just one in a line of 4 identically named individuals known over the 4 generations from his grandfather to his son. The praenomen, nomen, and cognomen were then the tria nomina system, which evolved actually over many centuries. Use of family names fell out of use in Europe during the 4th and 5th centuries following the collapse of the Roman Empire. Perhaps the reasons for this, in addition to the removal of Roman influence and citizenship, were that property ownership and general wealth diminished, and people no longer needed to demonstrate family connections for inheritance purposes. Now, the collapse of the Roman Empire, the associated economic downturn, and the move away from the use of family names also coincided with the onset of the Dark Ages cold period. These tougher times, no doubt, had significant impact on the well being of people across the continent, probably a decrease in population and less need to differentiate between people. Now, the why of using surnames as we define them now is fairly straightforward. As population increased, beginning about 1,000 years ago, there was a need to identify people more precisely. It would have been particularly true where people gathered in larger numbers, such as in villages, towns, or cities. I'll come back to this a little more when I discuss why then. For today, we want to look more closely at when the use of surnames as we know and understand them came into common use. As I indicated, the move to the use of second names began during the High Middle Ages, during the 11th to 13th centuries. That period is coincident with the medieval warm period in climatic terms. The first problem in determining when surnames appeared is in finding documentary sources, realizing that the further back we go, the fewer records there are that list people, at least other than those individuals in the upper end of the social, political, or economic spectrum. Family Search has an interactive graphic on their website shown here that lists many types of medieval records that might be reviewed. You can click on the document types and be transferred to other websites where you can see what they are and what they include. The first thing of note is that only a few go back to the 12th century. None on this list go back any further. These old documents are very useful in the review of medieval lifestyles, economics, and governance. In this talk, though, we're going to concentrate just on what names people were recorded under. One type we'll look at is close rolls that take us back to the early 13th century. There are a couple of sources not shown on this graphic that I'll also talk about. They do go back further and are thusly very helpful in looking at names. Also on that Family Search webpage are lists of some publications and links to other sources that have information about the medieval period. There have been studies of people and families that appear in some of these old records, such as the Domesday Book. Not surprisingly, most of them deal only with the major players or the landowners. The common people are not as represented in most of these biographical investigations until we get much further into the Middle Ages. But we can still discern how names changed by looking at a variety of documents, even if most of them pertain to the nobility or the landed gentry. Now, there are several types of documents produced in the late Middle Ages that might give us some clues. Many of the available documents can be found or at least linked to an on-site website called Some Notes on Medieval Genealogy. The link is shown here. Among the important ones are the Domesday Book and the 100 Rolls, church benefactor lists, tax and financial summaries, and of course land and lease records. Most are name-rich and of substantial value to genealogists. Both tax and property-related lists may be limited in the number of people that are recorded, as they tend to favor middle to upper class residents. What is most helpful are summaries that are continuous over long periods of time, have hundreds of names, and can be compared with other lists in order to see what changes might have occurred. Let's look at some of these. The Domesday Book, of course, was the survey commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1085 to provide details on the valuation of land holdings and resources, primarily for tax assessment purposes. It can be a starting point to find names in many parts of England. You can review the information and images of the book on Open Domesday website. The link is shown here. There's more information about people and places at the Domesday Book website. You can actually purchase a copy of the full translation from the National Archives bookshop. The book lists the owners and tenants in chief, principally the barons and churchmen who held the lands directly from King William. Almost 5,000 of them, from over 13,000 settlements listed in 40 old countries. Shown here is the first folio from the Devon Domesday records. Now, most of the names of men here were recorded with just one name and with a title or description of where they originated or with specific descriptors of what expertise they had. The majority were Norman knights who fought with King William or his allies who came over after the invasion. As the document is restricted to the 11th century, it does not help us to unravel when true surnames were adopted, but may give us a starting point as to when and where certain surnames originated. What we can confidently say, at least using this document, is that surnames were not in use during this time period of the 11th century. What has come to be known as the Second Domesday are the Hundred Rolls, or the Rotuli Hundredorum. A survey of land holdings in England was commissioned by King Edward I in 1279. The surviving returns were arranged by hundreds, hence they're named the Hundred Rolls, and give a picture of rural society, which its level of detail goes far beyond that found in the Domesday Book. 100 was a unit of English local government and taxation, actually, intermediate between village and shire, and actually survived into the 19th century. If this was intended as a second Domesday, it was a much superior version of it. The contrast is especially striking when it comes to the description of peasant tenures. Now, the rolls unfortunately don't survive for all regions. There's good coverage for parts of Huntingdonshire, Cambridgeshire, Bedfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and Warwickshire. Oxfordshire is the most complete, covering almost every hundred except two. The rolls were transcribed and published in 2 volumes in 1812 and 1818. You can search them for names, which is very interesting and useful, even though they're in Latin. You can download both volumes from Internet Archive or Google Books. Shown here are the pages from the transcribed rolls for Aylington, or Elton as it is known today in Cambridgeshire. The list for Aylington has the names of all landholders and tenants, from which we can determine how many had true surnames. In this case, 71 individuals of the total list of 113 were described with a second name, which may have been a surname. People who did not control their own land were not included in the list, so it's not representative of the entire population. We have to remember, though, that this is just a one-time snapshot, and the numbers may or may not be indicative of a trend in the use of surnames. Regardless, the list does show that surnames were in use by the late 13th century. There are a few old manuscripts preserved that contain entries of the names of friends and benefactors of some of the oldest churches in Europe and others who visited the establishments. They're called Liber Vitae, or Book of Life. They were not confined to churches in England, but can be found in many countries across Europe. The page actually shown here is from the St. Gallen Abbey in eastern Switzerland, which was founded in 719, abolished in 1805. The names were recorded in the belief that they would also appear in the heavenly book opened on the day of judgment. What we'll review here are manuscripts preserved from a few of the old English abbeys. One important church document we can study that spans the time before and after the Norman invasion in the 11th century is the Liber Vitae Ecclesiae Dunelmensis, or the Durham Book of Life. I wrote about this book in a 2018 paper in the Journal of One-Name Studies. The book contains over 11,000 names recorded from the 9th to the 16th centuries. Almost 8,000 names were recorded in the 12th to the 15th centuries, with entries from more than one century often written together on one page, unfortunately. Its end came just before dissolution of the Durham Cathedral Priory in the early 16th century. The compiled volume includes lists of names of royalty, landowners, and members of the religious communities, along with other historical comments from scribes and church leaders at various times. The pages offer a glimpse into the history of surname usage, particularly in what form they appeared. The original documents are available for viewing online through the British Library. The complete transcribed text was published in 1941 by the Surtees Society, and has also formed the basis of several academic studies. It's downloadable from the Internet Archive. In addition to the names listed, the Surtees publication also referenced the centuries in which the entries were made, so any patterns or history of names can be discerned. So here's a few pages. The earliest pages of names were likely recorded in the 19th century, as shown on the page on the left. The names are all single in form. They include the names of royalty and nobility, landowners and civil authorities, and church officials from archbishops and abbots to priests, deacons, clerks, and monks. In later centuries, a number of the earlier pages were reused to record names, as shown on the right. In addition to names from the 9th and 10th centuries, in the left column there, this one has later additions from the 12th and 13th centuries. There are many names written in between the older entries or on blank spaces at the ends of sections or in the margins. This is one of the first pages in the compilation that has what we might interpret as people with second names, perhaps the initial use of surnames. The one on the left reads Johannes Pictoviensis Episcopus, or Bishop John Pictoviensis. The one on the right reads Goffredus Dunelmensis Episcopus, or Bishop Geoffrey Durham, or more likely Geoffrey Bishop of Durham. Now, both could also be shortened versions of localities from where the name came from, or early versions of surnames. Pictoviensis may reference Poitiers, France, and Dunelmensis is, of course, Latin for Durham. These were entered probably in the late 13th century. The organization of the list of people got a bit more haphazard in later decades as more people came to the area and gave support to the abbey. Entries on the page on the left were done in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. They're clearly in different hands. In this time period, we start to see more references to place of origin or their residence. On that page, there are 76 entries of people with only a single name. 21 individuals are shown with a manor, estate, or monastery descriptions or locative names. 24 have a second or surname. Now, it's not always clear which is which. By the late 14th century and 15th centuries, entries with surnames were markedly more common. Of the 93 individuals shown on this page, 85 of them have surnames recorded. The bottom right corner on this page, which has been enlarged, with those names shown on the left. Most of the last names suggest locational or topographical origins and may have been shortened from estate or manor names. By the 15th century, surnames were recorded in the Durham Book of Life for the majority of people. Often whole families might be listed as members or supporters of the church. Perhaps this is a precursor of baptismal records. Entries with surnames began in earnest in the late 13th century, with the largest numbers recorded in the 14th to 15th centuries. Now, in the Surtees Society publication I mentioned, there are estimates in which periods the entries were made. We can get an idea of how name structure changed over time by plotting out the entries in the Durham Liber Vitae by the half century. Some are reasonably specific, where individuals can be identified, but most are given a broad time period, such as having recorded in the 13th or 14th centuries. Nevertheless, the graph of the numbers based on these broad time frames does show a distinct pattern. After the Norman invasion, we see a greater number of locative type names, that is, names that have a description of where the individual resided or came from. Moving into the 14th century, real surnames began to be used. The number of single name entries had dropped significantly by then. By the late 14th century, surnames were the largest category of names, reaching well over 2/3 of the entries during the 1400s. We replot that graph in terms of proportionality. We can see much more clearly how surnames use took over in the 14th century. So what we can take from this data is that in the early centuries, prior to about 1300 AD, most of the entries were of single names, as been shown in the previous slides. And prior to the 12th century, no one was referred to with either a surname or even a locative description. Another book of life preserved from the medieval rep period is the New Minster at Hyde Abbey in Hampshire County, founded in 901 and active until dissolution in the late 1530s under Henry VIII. Between the covers of this book are thousands of names of religious leaders and supporters of the church and an almost continuous record that shows when surnames first came into use. The page on the left contains names added during the 11th and 12th centuries. Most of the early entries were recorded in two columns that are labeled A and B there. Later entries were added on the left and right margins, interlined with the old names and rather haphazardly written into the upper and lower margins. One of the individuals identified is shown in the right central column, fourth from the bottom, at the letter E. Now that is Ednoth, who was the Bishop of Dorchester, Oxfordshire, who died in 1050. At the very top of the page is the name Ranulphus at the letter R, who's been identified as the Bishop of Durham between 1099 and 1128. From other information, he was also known as Ralph Lambard, giving us information as to the use of a second name. The page on the right has a list of individuals under a number of abbots of New Minster who are each noted in red, numbered 1 to 7. Knowing their tenure gives us a time frame for the entries. It's apparent that entries were made by different hands, perhaps at the times the abbots were actually in office. A particular note on this folio is that all names are singular, although the men have been identified from other sources with second names or locative descriptions. There are no designations of origin or residence recorded on the folio, and certainly no surnames attributed, but there were notes written into the margins by a man named Thomas Astle, a former keeper of records in the Tower of London and a noted literary antiquary. He ascribed descriptions or second names for many of these men. The notes also indicate that the entries were made through the 12th and 13th century, and again, obviously in different hands. A number of abbots and their supporters are listed in the left-hand folio, numbered 1 to 4. These men served during the 14th and 15th century. According to other research, all 4 individuals were known with 2 names or second names or surnames. Abbot Johannes, who served 1381 to 1394, was also known as John Eynsham. The second Abbot Johannes was known as John Letcombe. The third Abbot Johannes, not a lot of variability here, was known as John London. And Abbot Nicholas, number 4, was also known as Nicholas Strode. So surnames begin with individuals associated with Abbot John Eynsham in the late 14th century. Some are actually written on the page by Thomas Astle. From here to the end of the book, surnames are recorded. On the right-hand page are many full names as set out in the transcription there. These entries are from the late 15th century and all of them have surnames. Another medieval document relates to the Benedictine Abbey of St. Mary the Virgin and St. Botolph at Thorney in the Fenlands near Peterborough, Cambridgeshire. The Thorney Gospels and Book of Life was begun actually on the continent in the 10th century, but reached England fairly soon after, as shown by textual editions ranging in date from the end of the 11th to the end of the 12th century. These are some of the pages filled to overflowing with over 2,300 names relating to Thorney. Unfortunately, no dates are attached to the entries. Clearly, they were added in varying inks by different scribes and at different dates. There are also no individuals listed with surnames, but probably further study of the people listed could shed light on who may have been referred to with a surname and when. One summary that was added in the 15th century lists the abbots of the abbey from its inception in 972. Now, from this list, we can get a sense of the style of names, at least for those in charge. Single names are used from the 10th into the 13th centuries. Many of the men in the 11th century were part of William the Conqueror's retinue who came from Normandy. In the early 13th century, we see individuals with manor designations, for example, Richard de Stanford. By the early 14th century, second names are recorded, although for the most part they relate to locations near the abbey and likely where the individuals originated. By the 15th century, the individuals are being shown with true surnames, starting with Thomas Charwalton. who served from 1402 to 1425. Here again, we have a strong suggestion that surnames were uncommon through the 13th century, began to be used in the 14th century, and were fully in use by the 15th century. No surprise here. Now, there are several types of documents produced in the late Middle Ages that might give us some additional clues as to naming patterns and help narrow down the dates. I've lumped these together as administrative summaries, comprised by officials to note royal or government edicts, commercial deals, land or lease agreements, etc. Some recorded tax and accounting information. You can find references and links to these documents on the Medieval Genealogy website. Some of the more important documents in terms of naming people were maintained by the Chancery. They date from the end of the 12th century and include charter rolls, close rolls, feet of fines, pipe rolls, lay subsidies, and many others. Many of these records contain the names of ordinary citizens, not just nobility or royalty. So let's just take a closer look at some of these. Close rolls are a great source for names of individuals who were parties to agreements and activities. Because they go back several centuries, they can also show us how names were recorded and changed. The rolls show a variety of subjects. They have land assignments or grants, estate decisions and inheritances, appointments of people to specific positions, proclamations, incarcerations, legal suits between individuals, payments to employees, and commercial transactions. They're available online through Internet Archive or through the Hathi Trust Digital Library. You can see a list on Medieval Genealogy website. The close rolls are in Latin through 1274. From 1275, the publications are in English. Letters close were originally usually of an executive nature, conveying orders and instructions, and therefore of a private and personal nature. They were issued folded and closed by the application of a great seal. Copies of the text of the letters were written on sheets of parchment, which were then stitched together into long rolls to form a roll for each year. The first surviving close roll was started in 1204 in the reign of King John. The close rolls for the years 1204 to 1227 were published as abbreviated Latin text. Example is shown on the left here. Those for the years 1227 to 1272 were published by the Public Record Office between 1902 and 1938 with extended Latin text in 14 volumes. And there's an example on the right here from 1235. The post-1272 rolls have not been published as full text, but in calendar form, that is, as comprehensive English summaries with all significant details actually included. And they're under the title Calendar of Close Rolls. An example in the middle here is from 1350. In all, 47 volumes appeared between 1900 and 1963, covering the years 1272 to 1509. There are certainly many individuals listed from nobility and privileged major estate owners, some with their titles recorded, such as knights, earls, and barons. Uh, Most of the people are shown with their title, as well as with a locative or descriptive name, but often, again, only with a single name. This was particularly the case with clergy, such as abbots and bishops. But there are also a large number of ordinary citizens in the descriptive and locative category: clerks, court officials, constabulary, city and town officials, clergy, tradesmen, tenants of farms, convicted prisoners, merchants, and business owners. By the way, these documents are great for learning more about the history of various regions as well as the people. Occasionally, you can find descriptions of estate lands with ownership history and listed tenants. The center page from 1350 actually describes an assignment of dower, which has details of the lands and chattels involved, along with tenants' names and, of course, the names of all of the bride's relatives and her past relationships. It goes on for several pages. To get an idea of the types of names and the changes over time, what I did was I went through the volumes and selected out the first few pages from every 5 years beginning in 1230. Then I listed and counted the first 100 individuals named in those particular years. The names are highlighted in yellow on these various pages here. Now, when you plot out on a graph, the sample of names shows a significant change from locative and descriptive type names to real surnames in the mid 14th century. Throughout most of the 13th and into the early 14th centuries, true surnames are recorded for about 20 to 30% of the individuals. The proportion of surnames rapidly escalated during the second half of the 14th century to the point that 90% of individuals named on the close rolls had a surname by the beginning of the 15th century. Of these documents, use of locative, descriptive, and single names fell off almost completely by 1400. Another aspect of this transition is that for the most part, all family members adopted the common surname. Trend is a little easier to see if we smooth it and look at a 3-year rolling average in the number of name types. The 14th century was when the tide really turned in the use of surnames, as we saw with the church documents. So, Robin de Locksley or Robin le Hood, using the French or Norman structure, would have become known as just Robin Locksley or possibly Robin Hood. And Marion would not have been just referred to as Marion, wife of Robin de Locksley, but in fact as Marion Locksley, or perhaps Marion Hood. And all their children would have been Little Hoods. Here's an example of a last name as recorded in the close rolls, that of course for Shepheard. The name appears in quite different forms and with a range of spelling as you go back in time. In the earliest records, the word for shepherd is written in Latin as forms of Burcharius, often in lower case, indicating individuals may actually have been sheep owners. As one moves forward in time, a new name appears as Bircher, always as Le Bircher or the Shepherd. The Bircher name probably originates as an occupational name for a shepherd, deriving from the Latin word and the French version of berger. In England, it's most likely was influenced by the arrival of the Normans in the 11th century. Now we can get an idea of the time distribution of the various name types by plotting out their frequency in the rolls in this bar graph. The earliest close rolls had both Burcharius and Bircher, although there were only 2 or 3 entries per decade. The last mention of Burcharius was in 1270. The Bircher is first recorded in 1228, but is not associated with many individuals until the 1260s. By the 1330s, it had died out entirely. In the 1280s, we start to see the anglicized version, Le Shepherd, recorded. That was, of course, when records were published in English, too, which might explain part of the use of this name. Through the 14th century, the descriptive Le Shepherd disappears. The last occurrence is in 1385. By the 1330s, we are also seeing the name without the LE in front. The 1330s decade has the highest count of the surname Shepherd in these documents. Now, some may have been the same individual, recorded several times over the years, but we can't really confirm that. What we do know is that in the 1300s, they were not all shepherds with flocks of sheep. Many can actually be demonstrated to have had other occupations. So we can see in this specific name example is that a true surname does not appear before the early 1300s, matching the general statistical graph we just looked at. Now you might find similar situations in regard to other surnames. For example, early records for names such as Baker are Pistor or Pestor. Carpenter is obviously Carpentario. Clark is Clericus, Hunter is Venator. A merchant was written as Mercer. A shoemaker was shown as Sutoris. A smith as Fabrum or Faber. And may be preceded by Ori for a goldsmith, for example. Often they will be preceded by the preposition LE, especially into the mid-1300s. Now, most of these names had died out as the other had by the early 1300s. That's just a little sidebar here. The feet of fines documents are copies of agreements between parties with respect to land and used extensively between the 1190s and the 1830s. Note they were made in 2 or 3 duplicate copies on a single sheet of parchment, as shown on the left here, and then cut as marked on that example. The cut edges then could be matched later to ensure there were no changes made to one of the copies. So on this example, the bottom piece would be called the foot of the Fidefines. One published example I found was for the county of Huntingdon. Shown here on the right is a page that has several contracts agreed to during the reign of Henry III between 1261 and 1268. This and many other Fidefines calendars can be downloaded from Internet Archive. These records have the names of only those that owned or leased property, not the laborers, so again, they're somewhat biased in that regard. But they'll still give us a good sense of what names were used by people in the region, from which we should be able to see trends in surname usage. The records are set out by regnal year, beginning with Richard I. Among the highlighted names on that page on the right are single names such as Mabilia Filia Wilhelmae, or Mabel, daughter of William, at the top in entry 243, and Johannes or John, master of the hospital in entry 248. Many of the abbots and priors of various abbeys used only one name. There are descriptive names such as Wilhelmus Lemoyne or William the Monk in entry 246. There are locative names such as Wilhelmus de Folksworth or William of Folksworth, also at the top in entry 243. And there are a few surnames such as Robertus Russell in entry 247. I went through all the entries from 1193 to 1400 and plotted the numbers of all the name types to see what pattern existed in their use. Single names dropped off almost to zero by 1300, the only ones left being used to identify a few higher church officials. Surnames gradually increased in use through the 13th century, although some of them may have been shortened versions of descriptive names rather than true family names. In any event, their use certainly did increase into the mid-14th century. About the time of the famines and plague years, in the middle of the 14th century, the incidence of surnames increased markedly to well over 80%. The use of locative names dropped off at the same time in the 1300s, being left in use mainly by large landowners and nobility. And within 2 decades of the 15th century, all individuals were recorded with surnames. Lay subsidies consist of rolls of accounts, assessments, inquisitions, certificates, and other documents bearing on the assessment and collection of taxes. The lay subsidies began in 1207, but only 7 were granted before 1290, with 16 further levies by 1332. Each of these involved a separate assessment of the movable property of every taxpayer, and then a stated fraction of the total amount would be payable in tax. In 1334, the procedure was simplified. Tax liability was shifted from individual taxpayer to the village or town where he lived. Now, the question of who should pay was left to local discretion, this being a result of the death or impoverishment of so many individuals, the reasons for which I'll come to in a minute. The graph here shows the proportion of locative and descriptive names versus surnames as recorded on 4 subsidy lists for the Rape of Hastings, which was a subdivision of Sussex County, in 1296, 1327, 1332 to 3, and 1534 to 5. The lists are online at British History Online and the Sussex Record Society websites. Note that the population of the area declined into the early 14th century, but by the 1500s it not only recovered but almost doubled. Certainly you can see the proportions of surnames versus other names by that time period. So we've seen many types of documents that show when surnames came into common use. So let's deal now with why surnames came into common use when they did. As we've seen in the examples, the addition of family names became more common around the turn of the 14th century. So why then? Let's look at what the environmental conditions were like. The medieval warm period lasted from about 900 to 1300. It saw several centuries of warm temperatures, benign and stable weather patterns, ideal growing conditions over very long periods, and consistently bountiful harvests. The result was a healthier populace, mostly resistant to disease, increased mobility of workers and types of occupations, rapid development of urban areas, The favorable climatic conditions resulted in a period of sustained growth in population, which culminated in the late 13th century. The population of Europe actually increased from less than 50 million at the beginning of the medieval warm period to over 80 million at the end. With substantially more people, there was an increasing need to identify them more precisely, which meant with more than just a forename. And then it all changed. From the early 14th through the mid 19th century, the world was colder, weather was unstable, growing seasons were shortened or disrupted, food production of all types was especially challenging, overall living conditions were harsh, famine became common beginning in 1315 across Europe, outbreaks of disease and plagues beginning with the Black Death in the 1340s carried on. This period of dearth was known as the Little Ice Age. The dramatic and rapid swing in climate resulted in much of the land cultivated during the medieval warm period being abandoned. There was widespread migration of people, particularly into the towns that had been established. And there was a substantial increase in the number of landless people as well as the unemployed. Now, with the onset of a cold climate, unstable weather, poor farming conditions and results, epidemics and famine, population, of course, was negatively impacted. Famine conditions hit hard and quickly in the early part of the 14th century. They were probably made worse by the fact that previous decades had seen a greatly swollen population and a relatively static resource base. The Great Famine of 1315 to 22, which peaked in 1317, impacted almost all of Europe, killing at least 25% of the population. That event was probably the single most devastating disaster in European history. The decades following the Great Famine were not kind either, with a succession of severe harvest failures and a collapse in the economies. Reduced agricultural production resulted in the impoverishment of farmers and the wholesale unemployment of most of the laboring class. Destitute farmers, workers, as I said, headed to towns to find work and social support. All of this, of course, meant less income for landowners, particularly those highly placed members of the feudal society, and obviously less tax revenues to support social programs. Famine continued to be a frequent visitor throughout the Little Ice Age, as shown on the third graph from the bottom here. Note the coincidence with the coldest part of the Little Ice Age. The Black Death or bubonic plague first struck in 1346, taking another 25% of the population. Outbreaks continued in most regions through the 17th century, with minor occurrences in the 18th, 19th centuries, as you can see on the top diagram. The concurrence of prolonged military activity resulted in property destruction and heavy taxation to support the armies, and all of it contributed to an even wider crisis. Now we had a continuing situation where most of the people in every region were destitute and dependent on the church and government agencies for their very survival. Let's just compare the images showing climatic periods and the use of surnames that we saw from the analysis of close rolls. You'll recall that many other document series also showed the same timing for the changes in names. There's a clear relationship between the increased use of true surnames and the transition from the warm climatic period to the cold one. Most significantly, the change occurred basically within a century. Now, during the High Middle Ages, coincident with the medieval warm period that I mentioned, institutions were created and programs were developed to care for the poor and the infirm. Originally, they were called hospitals or bead prayer houses or almshouses. Many were begun and run by local monasteries or abbeys, which had the resources to support these establishments. Over time, other benefactors participated, including the aristocracy, merchants and liverymen, that is, trade unions and guilds. The oldest almshouse foundation still in existence is thought to be the Hospital of St. Oswald in Worcester, founded in 1990, or 990, I should say. By the mid 1200s, there were about 390 hospitals in Britain. Medical treatment obviously was primitive by today's standards, with healing and religious practice kind of going hand in hand. Hospitals consisted mainly of a place to rest, clean bedding and clothing, baths, wholesome food, and of course, regular prayer sessions. This help and these institutions were the consequence of decades of economic growth when resources were much more available to fund charitable causes. The advent of harsh living conditions, disease, famine, and poverty in the 14th century, that is the Little Ice Age, led to an expansion of almshouses and care facilities as more people sought food and assistance. By the mid 14th century, the number of hospitals had increased to about 540, and by the 1500s, there were about 800 of them. All relief was based on the parish, the smallest unit of local government, as well as the smallest ecclesiastical division, and it was through these organizations that assistance was provided. There was no single system of relief and no centralization. Some parishes were more generous than others in the amounts of relief they provided. The advantage of a parish-based system was that everyone knew everyone else, and it was in the interests of all that the poor, particularly the laborers, were looked after. The disadvantage was that the poor rates were borne by the same people who paid all other types of taxes, which stretched the limits of support within these various communities. Now, the timing of the Little Ice Age, with the downturn in living conditions and initial widespread death, was the catalyst for more government involvement, some of it to provide welfare for destitute citizens, some of it more to control the populace. Initial efforts, actually almost all efforts through the 16th century, were directed to protecting employers and landholders from the loss of laborers, as destitution led to mass migration into towns. All the early laws attempted to restrict the movement of people and fix wages. Now, they ended up being pretty much ineffective as people invariably went where work was available, and employers who needed workers hired anybody they could find. It would be decades and intense suffering through the cold period of the Little Ice Age before specific acts to assist the poor were actually formulated. The Poor Acts of the 1550s were the first to formally address poverty, but these laws merely downloaded the responsibility, creating collectors of alms in each parish. Local authorities and residents, primarily the churches again, were obliged to request, record, and distribute charitable donations for poor relief. Note that it was not until the early 16th century that parishes finally began keeping records of marriages, baptisms, and burials that could be used to keep track of people. The poor laws further provided that each parish would keep a register of all of its impotent, aged, and needy persons and the age they received. In all of this legislation and in the parish lists, then, both to control as well as assisting people, it was required that individuals should be identified, which then stimulated the use of surnames begun in the 14th century. Now, we're not going to find a lot of information about surnames at kiosks. Records of names include a wide variety of different types of documents, from tax lists to ecclesiastical summaries. They're not available for every region, as many have not survived if they were ever even produced. We can get a sense of the types of names and when they came into use only by going through older documents in detail and looking for information about what living conditions, political situations, and economic circumstances were in existence through the centuries. Just to wrap here, let's summarize what we know. Populations had increased significantly during the medieval warm period, so references to places and occupations came to be added to names and used to document people. These locative and descriptive terms were used much like surnames, but their use did not confirm that all people using such designations were actually part of the same families. The harsh living conditions during the Little Ice Age meant that greater numbers of people needed the support of churches and governments to survive. The only way that funds could be raised for or spent on social programs was to know who had the money and who needed it. A rapid transition into a cooler climate and harsher living conditions during the 13th and 14th centuries resulted in many social and political changes. It also meant that people had to adapt over a relatively short period of time compared to the previous hundreds of years of relatively benign and bountiful circumstances. One of the many outcomes of those changes was the emergence or acceleration of the use of surnames, something that happened within just a few generations. While the use of surnames was probably inevitable, what may have spurred their use was the need to identify people on tax and social assistant rolls by more than just their first or only names. So we might conclude then that Mother Nature and her impact through the climate crisis of the Little Ice Age hastened the introduction and widespread use of surnames. At least that's my theory. So I thank you for your kind attention. I hope you got some ideas out of the material that I presented. And I invite you to visit my blog sites occasionally as I add to stories involving Mother Nature and her impact on family history. You might also find my book on the subject of interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wayne, and thank you everyone for attending this session.